The needle slipped from Delia Fletcher's fingers and clattered against the floorboards at the sound of the knock, and her heart, which had grown so practiced at feeling nothing, lurched sideways in her chest like a startled animal. She had been sewing by candlelight, the same as she did every evening after supper, the same as she had done for the better part of 4 years since the war had taken everything from her and left her alone in the little house on the edge of Harlan Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1867. The candle burned low in its brass holder on the table beside her rocking chair, throwing long amber shadows across the pine walls, across the neat stack of mending she had taken in from the townspeople, across the small framed photograph of her brother Thomas that sat on the mantel above the cold fireplace. She had been working on a dress commission for Martha Elkins, a green calico with pearl buttons down the front, and her fingers had gone stiff in the October chill, and she had been thinking about nothing more significant than whether she ought to light the fire or simply go to bed early. Then the knock came. It was not the timid rap of a neighbor needing to borrow something, nor was it the impatient pound of someone carrying bad news. It was 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly, the kind a person makes when they have rehearsed the moment in their mind 100 times before arriving at the door. Delia set aside the green calico and smoothed her skirts and stood. She was 26 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with capable hands that were calloused from needlework, and from the work of keeping herself alive out here on the edge of nowhere. She was not the kind of woman who frightened easily, but she was also not a foolish woman, and so she picked up the small pistol she kept on the shelf beside the door before she opened it. The man standing on her porch in the October dark was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years spent under an open sky. He wore a long canvas duster that was dusty from the trail, and his hat was pulled low against the wind that had been kicking up from the north since sundown. He had dark eyes, dark as the sky behind him, and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of dark stubble. He looked at the pistol in her hand, and then he looked at her face, and he did not flinch. He just stood there with his hat in one hand and something else in the other, something small, though she could not see what it was in the darkness. "Miss Fletcher," he said. His voice was low and steady, and it carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had come a very long way. "My name is Clyde Brenner. I have been looking for you since the war." Delia Fletcher stared at him. The candle behind her threw her shadow out across the porch boards and touched the toes of his dusty boots. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of sage and trail dust and something faintly of horses. "You had better explain yourself," she said, "before I decide what to do with this pistol." He almost smiled at that. Not a mocking smile, but a tired, genuine one, as though he was relieved to find that she was exactly the kind of woman he had expected to find. "Your brother Thomas," he said. "We served together, 3rd Texas Cavalry under Colonel Parsons. I was with him at the end." The pistol did not waver in Delia's hand, but something in her chest did. She had not heard her brother's name spoken aloud by anyone except herself in over 3 years. The photograph on the mantel was the only company Thomas Fletcher kept these days, and he kept it silently. "Thomas died in '64, she said. "Yes, ma'am," Clyde Brenner said. "He did. And before he did, he gave me something, and he made me promise to get it to you. It took me longer than I intended. I am sorry for that." He held out the thing he had been holding in his other hand. She could see now what it was. A small leather cord with a brass locket hanging from it. Even in the low porch light she recognized it, because she had made that cord herself, braided it herself from a strip of brown leather and threaded the locket onto it, and she had pressed it into Thomas's hand the morning he rode away in the spring of 1862. Delia Fletcher lowered the pistol. She reached out and took the locket from Clyde Brenner's calloused fingers, and the moment the warm metal touched her palm she felt the grief she had managed to press down into something manageable rise up through her like floodwater through cracked earth. She pressed her lips together and breath through her nose and did not cry, because she was not yet ready to cry in front of a stranger on her own porch. "You had better come inside," she said. He stepped through the door, and she closed it against the wind, and she set the pistol back on the shelf with a deliberateness that she hoped communicated that she had not entirely decided to trust him yet, only to listen. She gestured toward the chair at the kitchen table, and he sat, setting his hat crown down on the table the way men who respected their hats did, and she put the kettle on the stove and added a log to the fire beneath it. "How did you find me?" she asked, with her back to him, watching the fire catch. "Thomas told me about you," he said. "He talked about you a great deal. He said you had the little house out on Harlan Creek, left to you by your aunt. He said you were the best seamstress in 2 counties and the most stubborn woman he had ever known, and he meant that as high praise." He paused. "When the war ended, I was in bad shape. It took me a year before I could travel. Then I went to the address he had given me in Georgia, but the family there said you had gone west. It took me another year and a half of following your trail. You moved around some." "I did," she said. She turned to face him. "I went to Georgia first after I got the letter about Thomas, to be with his regiment's family, the ones who were left. Then I came back here. This house was already mine and I had nowhere else to go." Clyde nodded. He looked at the table, at his own hands resting on it, and she took the moment to study him properly. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 31 or 32. It was difficult to say. The war had a way of adding years to men's faces that had nothing to do with the calendar. He had a long, straight nose and a scar along his left jawline, thin and pale, old enough that it had settled in as simply part of his face. His hands were large and scarred and rested on her kitchen table with a quietness that she noticed because men's hands were rarely quiet. The kettle began to steam and she made 2 cups of coffee, strong and black because it was all she had, and set one in front of him and carried the other to the other side of the table and sat across from him. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything about how he was at the end." And so Clyde Brenner, in the low light of Delia Fletcher's kitchen with the wind pushing at the walls of the little house, told her. He told her that Thomas had been a good soldier and a better man, which he said were 2 different things and not always found together. He told her about the camp at Palmito Ranch, down near the Rio Grande in May of 1864, and he told her how Thomas had taken fever, and how it had moved fast the way fever did in those camps where everything was damp and close. He told her that Thomas had been clear-headed at the end, that he had been thinking about home, about Delia, about the house on Harlan Creek, and the way she used to sing while she worked. He told her that Thomas had pressed the locket into his hand and said that Clyde was the most reliable man he knew and that he trusted him to get it done. Delia listened. She held her coffee cup in both hands and she listened to every word, and when Clyde stopped talking she asked questions and he answered them all as fully and honestly as he could, and they sat there like that for a long time while the candle burned down on the table beside her rocking chair and the fire in the stove settled into steady heat. When there was nothing left to tell, silence came down between them like a third presence in the room, heavy and not entirely uncomfortable. Delia turned the locket over in her fingers. She already knew what was inside it, a small painted portrait of her and Thomas as children, done by a traveling artist who had come through when she was 8 and Thomas was 10, their faces round and serious the way children's faces are when someone tells them to sit still and be painted. "You have been carrying this a long time," she said. 3 years, he said, closer to 3.5. "What did you do in the time between the war and now?" He looked at her steadily. "Worked," he said. "Cattle drives mostly. Worked a ranch up in the Panhandle for a while. I am not a man who does well when he is not working. And I was not ready to come until I felt I could come properly." He paused. "I wanted to be able to look you in the eye and tell you that your brother was spoken of well and that he died without suffering more than he had to. And I could not tell you that last part right away because for a while I was not entirely sure it was true. But I have had time to think on it, and I believe it now." Delia looked at him. It was a strange and particular kind of honesty, and it surprised her because she had not been expecting it. Most men, in her experience, rushed to reassure. They said what they thought would comfort rather than what was accurate. Clyde Brenner, apparently, did neither. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for everything, the locket and the honesty and the 3.5 years of looking. He nodded once, picked up his hat. "I will not take more of your evening. I only needed to deliver what I promised." "Where are you staying?" she asked, because Harlan Creek was a small place and she knew the answer before she asked it. "I saw a livery stable when I rode in. I expect the owner might know of a room somewhere." "That would be Amos Perkins," she said. "He has a spare room above the livery and he lets it for 50 cents a night. He will probably be awake still." She hesitated and then said what she was thinking. "You are welcome to breakfast in the morning if you want to tell me more about Thomas. I find that I am not finished hearing about him." He looked at her for a moment. "I would like that," he said. He took his hat and his duster and his tired, trail-worn self out into the October dark, and Delia Fletcher stood at her door and watched him walk down the path toward town until the darkness took him. Then she went back inside and sat in her rocking chair and held the locket to her chest, and finally, with no one to see it, she let herself cry. She cried for Thomas, who had been dead 3 years and whom she had never properly wept for because there had always been something that needed doing. She cried for the years of aloneness in this little house. And somewhere underneath all of it, so quiet she could almost pretend she did not hear it, something else stirred. Something that had been very still for a very long time. Clyde Brenner came to breakfast the next morning at 8 o'clock, clean-shaven and in a fresh shirt, which told her he had washed up at the pump behind the livery and that he owned at least 2 shirts. He brought a small paper bag of sugar from the general store, which told her he had noticed she had not had any to put in the coffee the night before. It was a small and attentive thing, the kind of thing a person only noticed if they were paying close attention, and Delia noticed that he had noticed. She made biscuits and fried salt pork and the strong coffee she was good at, and they sat at the kitchen table while the morning light came through the east window and made the room look warmer than it was. He told her more about Thomas, about the funny things as much as the serious ones. Thomas's habit of naming every horse he encountered whether it belonged to him or not, his ability to sleep through cannon fire but wake immediately at the sound of rain, the way he had once traded his entire tobacco ration for a book of poetry and read it until the cover fell off. Delia laughed at that one, a real laugh that surprised her. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. "He read everything. He would have driven Mother to distraction with it if she had lived long enough. She always wanted him to be more practical." "Were you practical?" Clyde asked. He was looking at her with a direct and genuine curiosity, not the idle kind that filled silences but the real kind that expected a real answer. "I was," she said. "I am. I had to be." She looked at the neat stack of mending on the chair in the corner, Martha Elkins's green calico on top. "This is what I do. I sew. I take in work from the town. I have a small kitchen garden in the summer. I am very good at getting by." "There is no shame in that," he said immediately, and in a tone that made it clear he was not simply being polite. "I know," she said. "I have never felt shame about it. I only mention it so you understand what kind of life is lived in this house. I do not want you to think it is more than it is." He looked around the kitchen, at the neat curtains on the window she had made herself, at the herbs hung to dry along the ceiling beam, at the small bookshelf beside the fireplace with Thomas's poetry book among the others. "I think it is more than you give it credit for," he said. After breakfast, he helped her carry water from the well behind the house, which she had not asked him to do but which needed doing, and afterward he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands in the way he did when he was about to say something that mattered. "I should ride on," he said. "I have no particular reason to stay, and I do not want to impose." Delia Fletcher, who was a practical woman, looked at him for a moment and thought about the word reason. "You said you worked cattle," she said. "Do you know about horses?" "I do. Old Ben Harker on the far side of the creek has been trying to trade a horse, and he has been asking for someone who can evaluate the animal honestly. The buyers he has found so far have either tried to swindle him or been swindled by him, and nobody has been happy. He mentioned it to me last week. I imagine he would pay for an honest evaluation. Clyde looked at her with those quiet dark eyes. I can do that, he said, if you think he would want the help. I will send him a note, she said, and she could hear in her own voice a certain practical steadiness that she was using to cover the fact that what she was really doing was finding him a reason to stay, and she suspected he knew it too. He found a reason to stay, and then another, and then another. Ben Harker paid him $2 for evaluating the horse, which led to a recommendation to help drive a small herd of cattle from Harker's ranch to the market in Waco, which paid well enough that Clyde could stop worrying about his funds, which gave him the freedom to accept when Delia asked him one evening, about 2 weeks after his arrival, if he would mind fixing the broken step on her porch before someone twisted an ankle on it. He fixed the step, and then he noticed the loose shutter on the east window and fixed that too. And then it was supper time and she had made stew, and there was enough for two. This became a pattern so gradually that neither of them could have pointed to the moment it became a pattern, the way seasons change. He had his room above Amos Perkins' livery and she had her little house, and during the days he found work around Harlan Creek, and during the evenings he had supper at her table more often than not. They talked. They talked the way two people talk when they have both been quiet for a long time and have saved up a great deal of things worth saying. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about his father who had been a difficult man to love and whom he had loved anyway, about the 2 horses he had owned before the war and how he had grieved both of them. She told him about her mother who had died of fever when Delia was 16, about the years she and Thomas had kept the household together, about the strange peace she had found in sewing, the way it gave the hand something certain to do while the mind worked through uncertain things. One evening in early November, he arrived for supper while she was still at the sewing machine, working on a commission for the Reverend's wife, a dark blue wool dress that needed to be done before the first cold Sunday. She called to him to come in, and he sat in the chair across from her rocking chair and watched her work, and there was nothing awkward in it. The way there sometimes is when someone watches you doing the thing you are best at. He watched with the same attentive quietness he brought to everything, as though he was genuinely interested in the mechanics of what she was doing, the way she turned the fabric, the way she smoothed the seam with her thumb before she ran it under the needle. Thomas said you could sew a saddle blanket into a Sunday dress if you had to, he said. She glanced up. He exaggerated, a little, the corner of her mouth curved. Where did he say that? One night around a fire the winter before Palmito Ranch. A bunch of us were talking about home the way soldiers do, about what we were going back to. Thomas talked about you for about an hour. He paused. He was very proud of you. Delia looked back at the blue wool. Her throat tightened. He never told me that, she said quietly. Men rarely tell the person, Clyde said. They tell everyone else. She looked up at him then, and he was looking at her with an expression that was open and careful and something else that she was not yet ready to name. The candle on the table between them made the room very small and the night outside very large, and Delia Fletcher felt something shift in the architecture of her ordinary careful life, a wall moving, a door becoming visible where she had thought there was only wall. She looked back at the blue wool. I am glad you told me, she said. The first Sunday in November was cold and clear, the kind of cold that had real edges to it, and Harlan Creek's small church was full because the cold always drove people to warmth and community. Delia sat in her usual pew near the back, and Clyde sat beside her because it was simply where he had walked to when they arrived together after the walk from the house. He was too large for the narrow pew and his shoulder pressed against hers throughout the service, and she did not move away. After the service, the congregation gathered outside in the thin, pale sunlight, the women in their shawls and the men in their good coats, and Delia introduced Clyde to people she knew, which was most of them. She watched him with the townspeople, and she noticed how he was with them. He was honest without being blunt and respectful without being deferential, and he listened when people talked the way not many men did. Old Ben Harker clapped him on the shoulder and called him the most sensible man to set foot in Harlan Creek in years, and Clyde looked slightly embarrassed by this and caught Delia's eye over Ben Harker's shoulder, and she bit her lip to keep from smiling. Martha Elkins, who was Delia's closest neighbor and who had the useful quality of saying exactly what she thought at all times, cornered Delia near the church gate while the men talked among themselves. "He is a good-looking man," Martha said without preamble. "He is Thomas's friend," Delia said. "He came to bring me something Thomas left for me." "Yes, you told me," Martha said. "That does not answer the observation I made." Delia looked across the churchyard to where Clyde was talking with Ben Harker and the Reverend, and the morning light was on his face, and she thought that Martha was not wrong. She said nothing. Martha looked at her with a fondness that was edged with something like urgency. "Delia Fletcher, you have been alone in that house for 4 years and you are 26 years old. I say this as your friend. Notice things." "I notice plenty of things," Delia said. "Good," Martha said. "Keep noticing." November deepened and the nights grew long and cold, and Delia began keeping a fire in the parlor fireplace in the evenings rather than just the kitchen stove. Clyde had taken on steady work at Ben Harker's ranch, riding fence and managing the horses, and Harker had offered him room and board at the ranch house, but Clyde had declined, which meant he was still in the room above Amos Perkins' livery, and still appearing at Delia's door at supper time with some contribution. A pheasant he had shot, a bundle of firewood he had split at the ranch, once a jar of honey that Harker's wife had sent with instructions to give it to the pretty seamstress in town. "Did you tell Mrs. Harker I was pretty?" Delia asked, holding the jar of honey and looking at him with an expression that was composed and careful. "No," he said. "Then, I may have mentioned that you were not difficult to look at." She set the honey on the shelf beside the stove. She kept her back to him for a moment because her face was doing something she was not sure she wanted him to see just yet. Then she turned around and his expression was straightforward and a little uncertain, the way expressions were when a person had said a true thing and was not entirely sure how it had landed, and she found that she liked that uncertainty. She found that she liked him in a way that was specific and deepening and not at all the vague liking of general goodwill. "I will make cornbread to go with the pheasant," she said. "Sit down." He sat down, and she turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat. And outside the November wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwoods along the creek, and Delia Fletcher sang quietly under her breath while she worked the same way she always had since she was a girl, and she heard him go very still behind her, as though the sound of it was something he wanted to hold carefully. The trouble with Harlan Creek arrived in the form of 3 men on a Wednesday in the second week of November. Delia did not see them arrive, but she heard about it quickly enough, because Harlan Creek was a small town and news moved fast. They were drifters. The word went, the polite word that covered a range of less polite realities. They had taken up in the saloon at the east end of town, and they were not conducting themselves well. And the sheriff, a tired man named Aldous Webb who was getting on in years, was trying to manage them without provoking a situation he could not handle. Clyde heard about it at the ranch and came into town that afternoon and spoke with Sheriff Webb, and Delia heard secondhand that the 2 men had spoken at length, and that Clyde had a manner with difficult situations that came from having seen genuinely dangerous ones and knowing the difference. Whatever he said or did, the 3 drifters moved on by Thursday morning, and the town exhaled, and Ben Harker told anyone who would listen that Harlan Creek needed a man like Brenner. Delia did not hear any of this until Thursday evening when Clyde came to supper, and she asked him about it directly. "You helped Sheriff Webb with those men," she said. "Ben Harker says you talked them out of town." "I suggested they would be more comfortable somewhere with a larger saloon," Clyde said, "and that the sheriff here had more resources than he appeared to." He looked at her. "It was not heroic. It was mostly just talking. Sometimes talking is the harder thing," she said. He looked at her across the table and nodded slowly, as though she had said something that confirmed something he had been thinking for a while. "Yes," he said, "it is." After supper she brought out the locket, the one he had carried to her from the war, and she opened it and showed him the portrait inside. The painted faces of two children, a girl with dark braids and a boy with a serious expression and eyes that were Thomas's eyes exactly. Clyde looked at it for a long moment. "I wondered what was in it," he said. "I never opened it. It was not mine to open." "No," she said, "but I want you to see it now that it is back where it belongs." She paused. "Thomas trusted you with the most important thing he had left to give. That means something to me." He looked at her. "It means something to me too," he said, "that he trusted me. He was the best man I knew in those years, and I did not know many good ones." "Did the war take much from you?" she asked. It was a careful question, the kind you asked when you genuinely wanted to know and were prepared for whatever came back. "It took the version of me that thought the world was simpler than it is," he said. "And it took some men I cared about, and it took a couple of years that I might have spent differently." He thought for a moment. "But I am not sure I would have become who I am without it, and I have made my peace with who I am." He paused again. "Mostly." She liked that last word. Mostly was an honest word. Mostly was the word a person used when they were not pretending. "The war was unjust," she said, because she had thought about it a great deal in the years since. Whatever side men fought for, the dying was unjust. The men who sent them believed in things that were worth questioning a great deal more than they were questioned. Thomas believed he was fighting for his home and his community, and perhaps that was true as far as it went. But the world those men were fighting to preserve was built on things I cannot defend, and I have never known how to reconcile that. I think about it still. Clyde was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that was thoughtful rather than evasive. "I have thought about it too," he said, "a great deal. I was fighting alongside men whose reasons I did not always share, for causes I understood imperfectly, in a situation I had not chosen. I think most men who fought were in some version of that. It does not excuse the larger wrongs. It only explains how ordinary people end up inside them." "Thomas would have agreed with you," she said softly. Toward the end, when his letters came, he had stopped writing about the rightness of the fight and started writing about the men beside him and whether the chickens were still laying. Clyde laughed at that, a real laugh, and Delia laughed too, and the laughter of two people who have talked about hard things and come through to the other side of them is a particular kind of warmth. The days shortened and the cold deepened, and Clyde began building her a proper woodpile against the far side of the house, which she had mentioned in passing would be useful because the winter could get fierce out on the creek. He spent 2 Saturdays at it while she worked at her sewing machine with the window open so she could hear the sound of the axe, a rhythm she found she liked, the solid, reliable sound of work being done. One Saturday afternoon she brought him coffee and set it on the stump near where he was working, and he straightened and pushed his hat back and took the coffee and drank it. And she stood in the pale winter sunlight with her shawl around her shoulders and looked at the pile of split wood and the stand of cottonwoods along the creek, their branches bare and silver against the blue sky. And she thought that this was the most peaceful she had felt in a very long time, possibly in longer than she could clearly remember. "You do not have to do all of this," she said. "The wood, the shutter, the step." "I know," he said. He looked at her directly. "I want to." She looked back at him, and there was a moment between them, clear and still as water in a glass, that said more than either of them had yet said in words. Then the wind came along the creek and broke it gently, and she pulled her shawl tighter and said she had better get back to the dress she was working on, and he picked up the axe again, and the moment folded itself away neatly to be opened again later. Later came on a Thursday evening in late November when the temperature had dropped sharply, and the first real frost was on the ground. She had made soup and cornbread and they had eaten at the kitchen table, and afterward they sat by the parlor fire, she in her rocking chair with her mending, and he in the other chair with a book he had borrowed from her shelf, Thomas's old poetry book, which he had asked to borrow with a formality that had touched her. The fire was good and warm, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the distant sound of the creek. Delia was mending a shirt of Ben Harker's, a simple job, and her mind was not on it. Her mind was on the man across the hearth from her, and on the question of what was happening between them, which she had been turning over for weeks now with the same care and attention she gave to a difficult scene. It was love, she thought, or it was becoming love, the way water becomes ice slowly and then all at once. She was not frightened of it. She was, if she was honest, relieved by it, the way you are relieved when something you had been afraid might never come turns out to have been coming all along. She finished the shirt and set it aside and looked at him. He was reading with that same attentive stillness he brought to everything, his long legs stretched toward the fire, one hand holding the book and the other resting on his knee. He was, she thought, a very settled man, not rigid but settled, the way a good tree is settled, with room to move in the wind. "Clyde," she said. He looked up. "I want to say something and I want you to just listen to it," she said. She was a practical woman and she believed in saying things plainly, which Thomas had always called one of her best qualities and which had sometimes made other people uncomfortable. "All right," he said. "I did not know what to expect when you knocked on my door," she said. "I expected, I think, to receive a thing and say thank you and to have you ride on. I did not expect to find a person I wanted to know. I have not wanted to know many people in a long time, and I find that I want to know you." She paused. "I think you may already understand that. I think you may feel something similar. But I am a woman who lives alone and takes care of herself and has no particular talent for hinting, so I thought it was better to say it directly." Clyde closed the poetry book and set it on the arm of the chair and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "You are right," he said, "that I feel something similar. I felt it almost immediately, which surprised me, because I did not come here expecting to feel anything other than a relief at having kept my promise." He paused. "I stayed because of you, not because of Ben Harker's horses or the room above the livery, because every time I thought about saddling up and heading on, I thought about your kitchen table and the sound of your voice, and I could not make myself go." The fire settled and cracked between them. "Then do not go," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and crossed the small space of the parlor floor to her chair, and crouched down to her level the way you did when you wanted to be sure you were seen clearly and not just heard. And he took her hand in both of his, her needle-calloused fingers in his scarred ones, and he said, "I had no intention of going anywhere." She looked at his face in the firelight, close enough now to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar on his jaw, the particular steadiness of his expression, and she thought that whatever the war had made of this man, it had left the important things intact. She turned her hand over in his and held on. He did not kiss her that night. He held her hand by the fire and they talked until it was very late and the fire burned down, and the cold of the room became noticeable. And then he put on his coat and hat and went out into the November night with a kind of quiet happiness that she could see in the set of his shoulders as he walked down the path. She stood at the door and watched him and felt the cold air on her face and the warmth of the fire at her back. And she thought that this was the thing she had not let herself want for so long, that wanting it again felt almost like the return of a missing sense, the return of color to a long gray world. He courted her properly through December, which is to say that he was at her door every evening and at her table most mornings and at her side most Sundays, and the people of Harlan Creek were not blind. Martha Elkins told her that the whole town was talking about it with a satisfaction that suggested the whole town approved, and even Sheriff Webb, who was not generally given to personal remarks, told Clyde while they were talking about the repair of a fence near the edge of town that he seemed like a man who had found his feet at last, and Clyde had agreed and not pretended not to know what the old man meant. He kissed her on the 4th Saturday of December, on her front porch in the early evening with the temperature just below freezing and the stars coming out above the bare cottonwoods. He had brought her a Christmas gift, a small oil lamp with a good glass chimney, the kind that made better light than candles and was safer for close work. She had been touched by it in a way that went beyond the object, because it was again the small attentiveness of it, the noticing that she sewed by inadequate candlelight and the practical solution offered without fuss. She had set the lamp inside and come back to the porch where he was standing, and she had said thank you, and he had said it was nothing, and she had said it was not nothing, and he had looked at her in the cold December dark with the stars above them and said, "No, I suppose it is not." And then he had taken her face in his hands and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that was quiet and serious and knew what it was about. And Delia Fletcher felt the last of the walls she had built so carefully come down like snow from a roof in the warmth of the midday sun, quietly, inevitably, all at once. She kissed him back, and the cold air around them was irrelevant, and the stars were very bright, and somewhere down the creek a coyote called, the way they did in the deep Texas winter, and the night held them like a gift. He told her he loved her on Christmas Eve, which they spent at the Harker Ranch with a small group of neighbors, because Mrs. Harker had the only house large enough for a proper gathering, and the warmth and generosity to fill it. They drove out to the ranch in Ben Harker's wagon, Delia in her best dress, a dark red wool she had made herself with a white collar she had taken great pleasure in, and Clyde in the good coat he had bought himself at the general store in November on the grounds that he was staying through winter and needed something warmer than the canvas duster. He looked different in the good coat, more settled, as though he was putting down roots in the air around him. The evening at the Harker Ranch was warm and good, full of the smell of food and candles and pine boughs that Mrs. Harker had pinned above the doors, and there was music from a fiddle that old Charlie Meade played with more enthusiasm than skill, but enough skill to make dancing possible. Clyde danced with her, which surprised her a little because he was a tall man and tall men often did not dance, but he moved with a deliberate, careful competence that made her laugh and then get used to it, and then genuinely enjoy it, the warmth of his hand on her back and the light in his eyes when she laughed. They walked out onto the Harker porch late in the evening to get some air, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars were immense above the flat Texas plain, the kind of sky that made a person feel small in a way that was not frightening but humbling. They stood at the porch rail, and she could hear the fiddle music through the wall and the sound of the creek in the distance, and he turned to look at her. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, the way he said everything that mattered. "I did not plan to say it tonight, but it is true, and I find I do not want to wait any longer to say it." Delia looked at the stars for a moment, and then she looked at him. She felt the truth of her own answer clear and warm in her chest like the lamp he had given her, steady and sufficient. "I love you," she said. "I think I have for some time. I was only making sure I was sure." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She was a practical woman. When she was sure, she was sure. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they stood on the Harker porch under the immense Texas stars with the fiddle playing inside and the cold air on their faces. And it was a perfect moment, the kind that does not announce itself, but that the memory keeps whole and clear. He asked her to marry him on the first day of the new year, 1868, which was a Wednesday, which was not a romantic day, but was simply the day it happened to be when he could no longer not ask. He arrived at her door at mid-morning, which was unusual, and she opened the door with flour on her hands because she had been making bread, and he stood on the porch where he had stood that first October night in his canvas duster, and he said, without preamble and without any particular ceremony except the sincerity in his voice, that he wanted to marry her, and that he wanted to spend his life in Harlan Creek if she was in Harlan Creek, and that he understood if she needed time to think about it, but that he wanted to ask. Delia looked at the flour on her hands and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was steady and earnest and just slightly anxious in the way of a man who had said the most important true thing he knew how to say and was now at the mercy of someone else's answer. "You are asking me to marry you with flower on my hands," she said. "I am," he said. "That is very like you," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a yes," she said. He came in, and they celebrated with bread and coffee, and the warmth of the kitchen, and the particular joy of two people who have found each other across a long distance and a long time, and have decided to stop traveling. They married in late February of 1868, on a Saturday when the weather had relented enough to be called merely cool rather than cold. The Reverend performed the ceremony in the little church where Delia had sat in the same pew for 4 years, and the whole of Harlan Creek turned out for it, or nearly, which was the thing about small towns that Delia had sometimes chafed against and now simply accepted with warmth. Martha Elkins cried with a satisfaction that had nothing apologetic about it. Ben Harker gave a toast at the gathering afterward at the Harkers' house that was long and winding and heartfelt, and ended with something about good horses and good men both being worth the time you spent finding them, which made no strict logical sense and made everyone laugh anyway. Delia wore a dress she had made herself, ivory with pale blue trim, the finest sewing she had ever done, worked on in the evenings for weeks, every seam perfect, every button placed with the care of a person making something for the most important day of her life so far. Clyde stood beside her in front of the Reverend and said his words clearly and meant them, and when he kissed her in the church, it was less quiet than the first kiss on the porch, but no less serious. And the room clapped, and Ben Harker let out a sound that was more whoop than was perhaps appropriate in a church, but which no one could fault for its sincerity. They moved into Delia's house on Harlan Creek, which had always been the plan since it was a solid house in good repair, and which Clyde immediately began improving in small ways that accumulated into a transformed place. He built a proper lean-to shed for storage. He fixed the chimney that had always drawn poorly. He replaced the porch boards that had been soft since before Delia could remember and added a second rocking chair, which became his chair and which on warm evenings they both occupied, side by side, watching the creek and the cottonwoods and the sky doing what Texas skies did, which was generally everything at once. Clyde found permanent work with Ben Harker, managing the horses and helping oversee the ranch, and after a few months Harker offered him a partnership stake in the operation, which Clyde accepted and which gave them a steady and improving income. Delia continued her sewing work, not from necessity now, but because she loved it, and because she was genuinely the best seamstress in 2 counties, as Thomas had always said, and because there was always work for a woman with those skills in a growing frontier town. In the spring, Delia planted her kitchen garden as she always did, but this year there was more of it, because Clyde had expanded the beds over the winter, turning new ground with a methodical patience that had produced a proper plot big enough to supply them through the summer and into fall. She planted tomatoes and beans and squash, and the herbs she always hung from the ceiling beam, and in the long spring evenings she and Clyde worked the garden side by side, with the creek murmuring somewhere below the cottonwoods and the sky still pale and bright at 7 o'clock. One evening in May she told him she was expecting a child. She said it simply, as she said everything, standing at the kitchen table with the evening light coming through the window, and she watched his face do something extraordinary. Clyde Brenner, who was a composed and steady man, looked at her with an expression of such complete and open happiness that it made her throat ache, and he came around the table and put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead and held her face between his palms for a long moment, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh and held her, and she held him back, and through the open kitchen window the May evening came in carrying the smell of the garden and the creek and the particular sweetness of the Texas spring that was the same every year and was never old. The summer of 1868 was full and warm, and the pregnancy went well. Delia continuing her sewing work well into August, and only slowing when the heat and the size of her made it difficult to sit comfortably at the machine for long stretches. Clyde was attentive without being hovering, which she appreciated, because she was not a woman who enjoyed being fussed over, and he seemed to understand this instinctively. He made sure there was always water nearby, always firewood ready, always the lamp clean and filled with oil so she never had to sew by inadequate light again. Small things, always small things, that together built a life that felt tended and cared for. Martha Elkins helped Delia through the birth in late October, almost exactly a year after the night Clyde had knocked on her door with the locket in his hand. The birth was long but not dangerous, and by the morning of the second day, Delia held a son, a healthy boy with dark eyes that looked as though they could not decide yet what color they intended to be, and a great deal of dark hair, and a voice that had opinions and was not shy about sharing them. Clyde held his son for the first time with the same composed care he brought to everything, but his face was completely undone by it, and Delia, exhausted and half asleep, watched him walk slowly back and forth across the bedroom floor with the baby held against his chest, talking to the boy in a voice too quiet for her to hear the words, and she thought that this was the truest thing she had ever seen, and she closed her eyes and slept. They named him Thomas Clyde Brenner, after a man who had loved them both, and had sent them to each other across a war and 3 years of searching. Thomas Brenner was from the first a serious and curious child, dark-eyed and watchful in the way of babies who seemed to be taking notes. He grew quickly through his first year, sturdy and loud when he needed to be and peacefully quiet when he was content, and his parents found that he had his father's capacity for stillness and his mother's directness, which was a combination that would probably serve him very well in the world. The town of Harlan Creek continued to grow through 1868 and 1869. New families arrived from the east, following the railroad that was inching westward across Texas and bringing with it the particular energy and disruption of progress. New businesses opened along the main street. The church was expanded. A proper school was proposed and then built, which was a thing Delia cared deeply about for reasons that had to do with Thomas and his poetry book, and the belief that learning was not a luxury but a right. She was on the school committee from its first meeting, the only woman on it, which was a situation she addressed by being better prepared than anyone else in the room at every meeting, which was her method of dealing with most situations in which she was underestimated. Clyde supported this without comment, because he did not see anything that needed commenting on. He had known from the beginning what kind of woman she was. Ben Harker's ranch expanded, and Clyde's role in it grew alongside it. He hired 2 good men in the spring of 1869. One of them, a young Mexican cowhand named Eduardo, whose family had been in Texas for 3 generations, and who could read horses the way some men read books, and the other an older man from Kansas named Hiram who was quiet and reliable and had a gift for mending things. The ranch ran well, and Clyde was good at the particular combination of management and practical skill that good ranching required. In the evenings when the ranch work was done and Thomas was in bed, Delia and Clyde sat on the porch in their 2 rocking chairs, and the creek talked in the dark below them and the stars came out above the cottonwoods. They talked about everything and nothing, the way long-married people talked, comfortably and fully, able to be silent when silence was better. Sometimes she brought her sewing out onto the porch and worked by the light of the good lamp while he sat beside her, and it was a continuation and a completion of the image she had not known was incomplete the night he knocked, Delia Fletcher sewing by lamplight with Clyde Brenner beside her in the dark. One evening in the fall of 1869, she was out on the porch with her mending when he came home later than usual, and she looked up at the sound of his horse on the path and then looked again because he had something across the saddle in front of him. "What is that?" she called. He dismounted, and the something revealed itself to be a puppy, a large, ugly brown puppy with enormous paws and a dopey, amiable expression, which he held up with one hand the way you held up a puppy to demonstrate its existence. He was at the side of the road south of Harker's East pasture, Clyde said, coming up the path. Too young to have wandered that far on his own. Someone left him. Delia looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at Delia with the boundless, unearned confidence of a large-pawed animal that knows it will be fine. "You could have left him," she said. "I could have," he agreed. He set the puppy on the porch, and the puppy immediately sat on her mending. "I did not." Delia looked at the puppy on her mending and looked at her husband. She was 30 years old in the third year of her marriage, and she had a son who was almost 1 and a husband she loved with a depth that had been growing steadily since October of 1867, and now she apparently had a dog. She thought about what her life had been in the years before that knock on the door, the quiet, careful getting by of it, and she thought about what it was now, full of exactly this kind of thing, this warm, cluttered, particular abundance. "He needs a name," she said. "I thought you could name him," Clyde said. He sat down in his rocking chair. She thought about it. "Grant," she said, "because he is fat and looks optimistic." Clyde looked at the dog and then at her and laughed, and she laughed too, and Grant the puppy chewed on the corner of the mending with complete satisfaction. The winter of 1869 was hard, the hardest in several years, and Harlan Creek felt it. There were families in the outlying areas who were short on food and fuel, and the town organized to help where it could. Delia heading the effort from the church side and Clyde contributing significantly from the ranch's surplus. It was during this time that she saw most clearly what kind of man her husband was, not in the large gestures but in the specific ones, the way he knew which families needed help, and how to offer it without damaging the pride of people who had been managing on their own, and needed to feel that the help was simply a neighbor's act, and not a judgment on their situation. She told him this one night by the parlor fire, Thomas asleep in his cot in the corner, Grant the dog taking up most of the hearth rug. She said that she had known from fairly early on that he was a good man, but that the winter had shown her the specific grain of his goodness, and that she wanted him to know she saw it. He looked at her for a moment. "Thomas would have done the same," he said. "Your brother. This is his home too in some way. This is what he sent me to." She reached across the arm of her chair and took his hand, and they sat like that in the firelight while the wind came at the walls of the house that was theirs, and the fire held against it. Young Thomas learned to walk in February of 1870, 10 days after his father's birthday, as though he had been saving it as a gift, and the household was reorganized around this new mobility for several weeks, moving breakable objects to higher shelves, and adding a gate at the top of the porch steps, which Clyde built in an afternoon with Thomas sitting beside him handing him the wrong tool each time with great seriousness. The school opened in March, and Delia attended the first day not as a student but as a member of the committee, and because she wanted to see the children walk in, wanted to see the books on the shelves and the slate board at the front of the room, and the whole enterprise of learning made available to the children of Harlan Creek, regardless of where they had come from or what their parents owned. The schoolteacher was a young woman from Ohio, named Miss Prudence Cal, who was 22, and had more conviction than experience, and both in the right proportions, and Delia liked her immediately. Spring came as it always did, extravagantly, with everything blooming at once, and the creek running high from the snowmelt, and the grass on Harker's pastures greening overnight. Eduardo and Hiram and Clyde worked the spring cattle work with the focused intensity that the season required, long days and early mornings, and Delia kept the household and her sewing work, and the committee business, and Thomas, who was fully ambulatory now and interested in every corner of the yard and the garden and the creek bank, the last of which required vigilant management. In the evening she and Clyde sat on the porch in the spring warmth and watched Thomas toddle determinedly around the yard after Grant the dog, who was now very large and very gentle and deeply devoted to the boy. The cottonwoods were in leaf again, silver green and restless in the evening wind, and the sky was that impossible Texas blue that seemed too vivid to be real. And Delia thought often in those evenings about the fullness of it all, the specific rightness of a life that had found its shape. She told Clyde in May that they were expecting again. He was in the yard fixing the garden fence, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the porch step and told him. And he set down the hammer and came and sat beside her on the step and kissed her. And they sat like that for a while in the May morning with the coffee going cold, and the garden full of new growth and Thomas asleep inside. The second pregnancy was in some ways easier and in some ways harder. Harder because she had Thomas to manage at the same time, and because the summer was very hot, and easier because she knew what to expect, and because she was, as Clyde often said, the most competent person he had ever known. The baby came in November of 1870, again with Martha Elkins presiding. This time the birth was faster, the baby arriving with much less ceremony than Thomas had required. A girl this time, which Clyde held with the same careful wonder he had held Thomas, walking the same path across the bedroom floor, his voice the same quiet murmur that Delia could not quite hear but could feel in the room like warmth. They named her Clara after no one in particular, simply because when Clyde said the name and Delia looked at the baby's face, it was right. Clara Fletcher Brenner, which was the full name as entered in the church record, with Delia's family name preserved in it at her request and Clyde's agreement. Thomas, at 2 years old, was fascinated by his sister in the way of a child confronting a new and bewildering fact about the world. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked at her with an expression of intense concentration, and then he went and found his most important possession, a smooth river stone he had carried in his pocket for a month, and placed it carefully on the blanket beside her, which was his most genuine form of gift-giving. The years from 1870 to 1873 were good years, growing years, the kind that accumulate meaning in their ordinariness. Thomas grew from a solemn toddler into a quick-minded boy who loved animals and had an early and serious interest in horses, which pleased his father enormously and surprised no one. Clara grew from a quiet baby into a willful and cheerful child, who had Delia's dark eyes and Clyde's particular stillness when she was thinking, and who showed an early interest in fabric and color that Delia met by letting her sit at the table while she worked and giving her scraps to arrange. The ranch with Ben Harker continued to prosper. Harker was getting on in years and leaning more on Clyde's management, and by 1872, the practical running of the place was largely in Clyde's hands, which he handled with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. He raised Eduardo's wages to what they should have been from the beginning, which Eduardo acknowledged with a nod, and the quiet dignity of a man who had been waiting for the right employer to do the right thing, and was glad to have found him. Delia's sewing work evolved over the years. She had always been good, but she became something more than good, her reputation spreading enough that she received commissions from families in towns several days' ride away, dresses and suits for weddings and christenings, and the various important moments that required fine work. She taught sewing skills at the schoolhouse once a month, which she saw as partly practical and partly something else, a passing on of the ability to make something beautiful out of raw material, which seemed to her one of the more important things she knew how to do. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1873, Clyde and Delia sat on the porch while Thomas and Clara played in the yard below them, Thomas trying to teach Clara to throw a ball with something approximating accuracy, and Clara more interested in the ball's color than its trajectory. Grant the dog was very old now, gray around the muzzle and slow in his movements, but still present at every important moment in the household with his large brown body and his steady, undemanding affection. Delia had her sewing in her lap, the same as always because there was always sewing, and the light was good in the afternoon, and the sewing itself was a pleasure, a fine piece of embroidery work she was doing for the Reverend's wife's anniversary gift from her husband. She stitched and rocked and watched her children, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full spring leaf, and the sky was that blue again. "I have been thinking," Clyde said from the chair beside her. She glanced at him. He was watching Thomas and Clara with a quiet smile. "About what?" "About what Thomas said," he said. "Your brother, he told me to find you. Said if you got out of this war and you get the chance, you go find my sister. She will make sense of the world for you." Delia set her embroidery down and looked at him. She had not heard that before. He had told her many of Thomas's words, but not those ones. "He said that," she said. "He said it the night before he died," Clyde said. "I have been meaning to tell you for a while. I wanted to find the right moment." He looked at her. "He was right, you know. You do make sense of the world, for me. You always have from the first night." Delia Fletcher, who was 32 years old and a practical woman who did not cry easily, felt her eyes fill. She looked at the cottonwoods along the creek and blinked and breathed evenly, and after a moment took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, her needle-calloused fingers over his scarred ones, the same as that first night by the parlor fire. "Thomas always knew things," she said quietly. "He was always ahead of everyone else." "He was," Clyde said. "He was a good man. I am glad he sent me to you." She looked at him for a long moment in the spring afternoon, at his weathered face and the lines the years had made there. Kind lines. Lines that came from squinting into bright skies and from laughter, and the gray that was beginning at his temples, and the steadiness of him that had never changed from the first evening he sat across her kitchen table. She thought of the locket, which still sat on her dressing table, and which she touched every morning when she brushed her hair. She thought of the knock on the door in the October dark, of the candle burning low beside her rocking chair, of the green calico in her lap and the needle slipping from her fingers. "So am I," she said. Below them in the yard, Clara had managed to throw the ball in an entirely unintended direction, and Thomas was running after it with great enthusiasm, and Grant the old dog was watching both of them with benevolent disinterest. The creek murmured below the cottonwoods. The spring afternoon rested on all of it, on the yard and the house and the garden full of new green growth, on the two rocking chairs on the porch and the people in them, on everything that had been made from a knock at the door and the keeping of a promise. Grant died peacefully in the summer of 1873, in his place on the hearth rug, and they buried him under the largest cottonwood along the creek in a ceremony presided over mainly by Thomas, who was 6 and had strong feelings about proper goodbyes. Clara laid a flower on the small mound, and Clyde stood back and let the children lead it, which was right. The old dog had earned a proper send-off, and the children's grief was real and needed room. A few months later, Eduardo arrived at the ranch house one morning with the self-conscious formality of a man who has something to ask that matters to him greatly, and asked Clyde's advice about a matter of the heart, a woman in town he was hoping to court. And Clyde listened and gave his advice, and also took Eduardo aside and told him that a good man honored the woman he courted by being honest with her and patient with her and consistent. Because consistency was the thing that love was made of once the beginning part was through. Eduardo listened carefully and later told Clyde that the advice had been the best he had ever received, and Clyde said he had simply been paying attention to something he knew worked. The Harlan Creek School grew through these years, adding a second room and a second teacher in 1873, and Delia remained on the school committee and continued her monthly sewing class, which had grown beyond just practical skills into something more like an ongoing conversation between women about what they knew and what they wanted their daughters to know. Miss Prudence Cal, the schoolteacher from Ohio, had by now married Charlie Meade's son and become Prudence Meade, but kept teaching, which was still somewhat unusual, but which the town had come to accept as simply how things were in Harlan Creek, because Harlan Creek had Delia Fletcher on the school committee. In the winter of 1874, Delia told Clyde they would have a third child, and he received this news with the same happiness and tenderness as the first two, no less for the repetition, which was one of the things she most loved about him. He had a way of meeting each new thing as the new thing it actually was rather than a version of what had come before. This child, born in late July of 1874 in the heat of a Texas summer with the window open and the smell of the garden coming in, was a boy again, and they named him Samuel after Clyde's father, which was a decision Clyde had not expected to make, but which felt right when Delia suggested it, because she thought it mattered to carry forward the people who had made you even when those people had been difficult. And that naming a child for them was a way of saying that the whole of it was part of the story. Samuel Brenner was from his first days a different kind of child from either Thomas or Clara. Where Thomas was serious and Clara was willful, Samuel was cheerful in a way that seemed to come from some internal source entirely his own, as though he had arrived in the world already satisfied with it. He smiled early and laughed often, and by the time he was a year old had the whole household organized around his entertainment, Thomas reading to him with patient big brotherly authority, and Clara performing elaborate theatrical displays for his amusement. The family settled into itself in the way that families do when all the major questions have been answered, and what remains is the rich detail of living. Delia's reputation for fine work continued to grow. Clyde's role at Harker's ranch formalized into something that was by any real measure a full partnership, and Ben Harker, who was 63 now and slowing but sharp-minded, told anyone who asked that Clyde Brenner was the best thing that had happened to his ranch, and also, in his opinion, to the town. On a Thursday evening in the October of 1875, 8 years after the night that had changed everything, Delia was sewing by lamplight in her rocking chair on the front porch in the mild fall air. The good lamp that Clyde had given her for their first Christmas was still in service, its chimney clean and bright, throwing good steady light on the embroidery she was finishing. The children were in bed. Clyde was inside, and she could hear him moving in the kitchen, hear the quiet sound of his work. He came out onto the porch a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee, and set one on the small table he had built beside her chair, specifically to hold her cup and her thread box when she was working. And he settled into his own chair, and the night was around them, warm for October, with the cottonwoods still holding their leaves, gold now and rustling when the light breeze came off the creek. Delia worked her needle through the cloth, in and out, the motion so familiar by now that her hands could do it without her attention, while her attention was on the man beside her and the evening and the sound of the creek and the particular peacefulness of all of it. 8 years, she said. He glanced at her. He knew what she meant. He always knew what she meant. 8 years, he said. She looked at him in the lamplight. I want to tell you something, she said. All right, he said. The same words, the same attention, as the first time she had said those words to him by the parlor fire in November of 1867. When you knocked on this door, she said, I had been so alone for so long that I had stopped knowing what I was missing. I had made everything into a system, the sewing and the work and the routine of it all. I was very good at not wanting what I did not have. She paused. And then you came and said you had been looking for me since the war, and I did not know yet what that was going to mean. But I think about it sometimes that night, and I think that everything that is true about my life now is because of that knock. Clyde set his coffee cup down and looked at her. The lamplight was on his face, on the years that had settled there, and she thought as she sometimes did that she had loved this face across so many different lights and seasons that she could no longer separate the face from the love. Thomas knew, he said. Thomas knew, she agreed. She threaded her needle and pulled the thread through and smiled. He always knew things. Below them the creek moved in its bed among the cottonwoods. The stars were coming out above the flat Texas plain, the same stars that had been over the Harker porch that Christmas Eve when he had told her he loved her, the same stars that had watched him walk away down the path that first October night and come back the next morning. The land was the same land it had always been, ancient and particular and indifferent, but the life lived on it was something else entirely. Something made rather than found, made from a knock on a door and a locket on a leather cord, and two people deciding that what was between them was worth following all the way to the end. Delia Fletcher Brenner went on sewing by lamplight, and Clyde Brenner sat beside her, and the October evening settled into night around them, warm and dark, and full of the sound of the creek that ran year-round along the edge of the land they had made their home, carrying the water as it always did, patient and constant, past the house where the children slept and the dog had once been buried and the garden grew back every spring, carrying it steadily forward the way all good things did, the way love did. Unhurried and sufficient, carrying it on and on into whatever bright particular days were still to come. Thomas Brenner at 7 was already riding horses with a natural ease that made Eduardo shake his head and say the boy was born to it, and Clyde spent their Saturday mornings together in the paddock, patient and methodical, giving his son the gift of what he knew. Clara at 5 had appropriated a corner of Delia's sewing table and declared it her studio, and produced with great confidence a series of fabric arrangements that owed more to imagination than technique, but were entirely her own. Samuel at 1.5 was beginning to walk and had Clyde's dark eyes and the kind of determined focus that promised he would, in his own good time, make sense of everything he encountered. The little house on Harlan Creek was not a little house any more exactly. Clyde had added a room off the back in 1872 and was talking about adding another one for the children now that there were 3 of them, and the porch had been extended to run the full width of the house with the proper boards and the good railings, and the garden was twice the size it had started as. It was still the house Delia had inherited from her aunt, still the house that Thomas had told his fellow soldiers about by firelight in the winter of 1863, still the house she had been sitting in alone with her candle and her sewing when a man knocked and changed the whole of what was going to happen next. But it held more of the world in it now, more voices and more light, and more of the daily, ordinary, sacred business of a life lived fully and together. And in all of it, in every long day of it, in every evening on the porch and every morning at the kitchen table, and every night when the lamp was finally put out and the house went quiet, and the creek talked to itself in the dark, Delia Brenner knew exactly what she had, and it seemed to her the most astonishing and reliable and true thing in the world. The locket with its painted portrait of 2 children sat on her dressing table, and she touched it every morning. And Thomas in the photograph had the same serious eyes as her own son Thomas, and she thought that this too was right, that the people you loved went on in the world in one way or another, and that a man who had died of fever in May of 1864 had managed, before he went, to set in motion everything that had made his sister's life what it was. And that if he could have seen her on the porch in the evening light with her husband beside her and her children in the yard below, he would have looked the way he looked in the photograph, serious and deeply satisfied and exactly right. She sewed on, and the lamp burned steadily, and Clyde was beside her, and the night was wide and warm and theirs.